So, directed by David Robert Mitchell, who previously made The Myth of the American Sleepover, which kind of tells you something tonally about the film.
What does it tell me tonally? Because I missed that.
I'm just about to get there, okay? So it is basically a story that owes a great debt to Halloween in particular, and to the sort of the horrors of the late 70s, early 80s. The film seems to have an 80s setting. Actually, it's a modern-day setting, but it appears to exist in some kind of weirdly retrofitted present, in which everything about the score, which kind of harks back to that squishy synth sound of John Carpenter, and also I suppose you would think something like Jeff Grace's work and Cold in July. And it's a story of teens. It is a film in which parents tend to be largely absent, and when they're present, they're present as vacuous vessels. The story centres on 19-year-old heroine Jay, played by Michael Monroe, who we saw recently in The Guest. And at the very beginning of the film, she's started seeing this guy. And nature is taking its course in the way of teen movies. She has a circle of friends with her about whom she's talking to, about the way the relationship is progressing. Finally, her and Hugh have an assignation in the back of a car.
They're getting older.
Yes, they spend some time getting older together in the back of a car, which immediately starts bringing up images of Tale of the Hook, the way in which it's shot. The car, you immediately start thinking of Tale of the Hook, which is the great sort of psychosexual underpinning of a bunch of slasher movies. The story is, if you make out, then death comes. So the Tale of the Hook is two kids in a car, and there's a sort of hook-handed maniac on the loose, and it's sort of the sump of all those movies like Friday the 13th and Halloween and then post-Scream. And after this has happened, immediately the boyfriend is revealed to be a scheming louse who drugs her and then ties her to a chair and then explains to her that he has now passed on to her a curse.
This thing, it's gonna follow you. Somebody gave it to me, and I passed it to you, back in the car. It could look like someone you know, or it could be a stranger in a crowd. Whatever helps it get close to you. It can look like anyone, but there's only one of it.
Now, the interesting thing is, I know that It Follows has really freaked some people out. Some people found it really scary. I didn't find it particularly scary, partly, I think, because I was more interested in the way in which it was taking genre conventions and playing with them. The central story is then that this is a curse which is passed on through sex, but actually it can only be passed on to the next person through more sex, and that then has to carry on and carry on, or the chain of the curse can come back. So basically, it's one of those, it's playing with the standard ideas that inflect all those post-1978, early 1980s slasher movies, which is the sex-death equation, which is, as old as the hills, but it's doing something sort of slightly subversive and interesting about it. It has to be said, it wants to have its psychosexual cake and eat it. I mean, it indulges as many genre cliches as it examines, as it unpacks. I mean, so there is a huge amount of people running around places in their underwear, and more. So it's not that the film...
You mean and less?
And less. It's not that the film completely disavows those things. It sort of plays with them, even whilst it is unpacking them. But what gives it an edge is that, having done Myth of the American Sleepover, which is this sort of bittersweet, coming-of-age tale, what the director is really interested in is the relationship between the central teenagers. The lead character, Jay, has something of that glacial alienation of a kid's era Chloe Sevigny. And incidentally, I think Larry Clark would delight in the portrayal of a world in which parents are an absence and they're certainly not a protective presence. So that's the first thing. The second thing, it is interested in the interplay of the relationships between those people and the way in which they're actually, the friends are generally more supportive than they tend to be in this kind of generic movie, although they do have their own motives, and the film is interested in their motives and is interested in their characters. The second thing is that it has a fairly straightforward setup, which is that you will be pursued by this wraith. This wraith can appear as absolutely anything, but the one defining fact is that it will pursue you at walking speed. And it's a film which, you will see parodies of this very, very soon, that all the way through the film, whoever it is that is currently hosting the curse is looking around them to see if there's anybody walking towards them. And if there is, the first thing is, can you see that? Because if anybody else can't see it, it's the wraith. So there's a actually very well developed threat of just people walking in the far left corner of the frame. As soon as you see people walking at a perfectly normal speed, it starts to become creepy. Now,
that sounds good. That sounds
exactly.
Really good.
There are crash bang wallop set pieces, and when they come, they do deliver, scares and shocks. And certainly in the screening that I was in, those were working. But the reason they work is because of the heft and the weight that is built up through the interim sequences in which nothing very much appears to be happening. So it's interesting. I mean, it's almost like, a way of describing it might be if you sort of think of that, post Larry Clark, Harmony Korine. I'm not a fan of Harmony Korine at all, so actually let's get rid of that. If you think of that sort of post Larry Clark portrait of teen life, that alienated Gen X teen life thing, and then you combine that with the plot structure, and there are scenes in it that absolutely capture Halloween. I mean, there are scenes walking around the streets of Detroit. Incidentally, Detroit and Michigan, the locations are used very well. The change between the suburban and the sort of the moderately well-to-do, and then these other areas which are kind of deserted and haunted housey. And it uses those locations very well. But there is an awful lot of the camera sort of prowling around on the streets, looking over the shoulders of its protagonists. There are sequences from, when I did a documentary about Halloween years and years ago, we went to North Orange Grove Avenue, but you can still walk down. It's in Hollywood. It's not meant to be, but you can walk down it, and you feel like you are walking along the streets of Haddonfield. You feel like you feel like Michael Myers is going to be walking behind you. And actually, what's interesting about this is it does feel like it's stalking the ghost of Michael Myers. I don't think that it's quite perhaps the revolutionary horror film that I think some people think it is. I think it's very well executed. I think it's as I said, it indulges as many dodgy cliches as it unpacks, but it's put together in a way which, because it's primarily interested in the characters and their interactions, or sometimes their alienation from each other, all that stuff proves that, as always is the case with horror, things work and things are scary because you're made to care about the people and you're made to care about the characters. There's also an extended set piece in the third act in which we move to a swimming pool surrounding, which seemed to me to be referring to something like Let the Right One In, which again is set in 1982, but seems to have this very timeless setting. The whole film deliberately has this slightly time-shifted, slightly woozy, slightly out of kilter feel. So it's ambitious and interesting. It's not without flaws, and it's certainly not as radical as perhaps some people think it is. But it's very well constructed, and it didn't scare me. But I know that it scared other people, and that's fine. But I was interested in it, and because I thought that what it was doing was being literate and actually wanting to make a movie about teen relations in which the function of the curse, the kind of Candyman Ringu section of the narrative, the thing that's driving it, the train that's driving the narrative, he's sort of less interested in that than he is in the relationship between the characters.